There's a rule every sailor learns on day one. When a battle breaks out, you get to your battle station. You stay there. You do not move unless ordered. Bruno Gaido knew that rule. On February 1st, 1942, he broke it. And because he did, one of America's most critical warships survived to fight another day. 8 weeks. That's all the time that had passed since Pearl Harbor. 8 weeks since the smoke stopped rising from Battleship Row. 8 weeks since America lost the bulk of its Pacific battleship fleet in a single morning. The Navy was wounded, shaken, and desperate for something, anything, that looked like a win. The USS Enterprise was one of only 3 operational aircraft carriers left in the Pacific. She wasn't just a ship, she was a lifeline. Bruno Peter Gaido grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a working-class kid in a working-class city. When he was 18, he told his father he wanted to join the Navy. His father said no. So Bruno waited. He worked farms. He worked a brewery. He watched Europe fall apart from across an ocean. 6 years of waiting while the world edged closer to catastrophe. When his father finally said yes in 1940, Bruno walked straight to the nearest enlistment office. He became an aviation machinist, the men who kept carrier aircraft alive between missions. But Bruno had a talent that went beyond wrenches and engine oil. He was absolutely, almost dangerously, unafraid. Before the war, a newly assigned pilot named Lieutenant Norman Dusty Clias climbed into an SBD Dauntless for his very first carrier qualification landing. These landings were terrifying, even for experienced pilots. A moving runway barely 800 feet long, a tail hook meant to catch a wire at over 70 miles per hour. The rules were clear. On qual flights, you flew solo. Sandbags sat in the rear seat to simulate weight. No second person risked their life for a training run. When Clias settled into his cockpit and looked back, there were no sandbags. There was Bruno Gaido, already strapped in, already calm. "What are you doing here?" Clias demanded. Gaido shrugged. "You've got wings, haven't you?" 6 perfect landings. Clias went on to become one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots of the entire war. He never forgot the machinist who bet his life that the pilot wouldn't fail. Admiral Chester Nimitz needed to show America it could still fight. On February 1st, 1942, a Sunday, just like Pearl Harbor, Enterprise launched the first American offensive strike of the Pacific War against Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. Dive bombers hit airfields. Ships burned in the harbors. For one morning, America was the one doing the attacking. But Japan was not done. As Enterprise turned for home at full speed, 5 Japanese bombers tracked her down. They had flown out of Kwajalein Atoll, and they found her. The 5 Mitsubishi G3M bombers came in from the starboard bow at 10,000 feet. Every anti-aircraft gun in the Enterprise opened up. Wildcats from the Combat Air Patrol tore into the formation. 4 bombers dropped their payloads, missed entirely, and turned back toward home. The 5th did not turn. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai's plane was already on fire. The Wildcats had torn through it during the approach. Flames streamed from the engines. He was never making it back to Kwajalein. So he made a different calculation. Nakai had a dying plane and a simple math problem. He could try to nurse the burning aircraft back to base, a journey he had no chance of completing. Or he could do something else. He banked the bomber hard to the left and aimed directly at the Enterprise's flight deck. This was not official Japanese policy in 1942. The organized kamikaze program wouldn't exist for another 2.5 years. But Lieutenant Nakai reached the same conclusion on his own in the final seconds of his life. If he was going to die, he was going to matter. From the catwalk, the narrow walkway running along the edge of the flight deck, aviation machinist Bruno Gaido watched the bomber get bigger. Every gun on the ship was firing. None of it was working. The plane was still coming, lower now, trailing fire. Gaido's battle station was the catwalk. His job was to stay there. He had no orders. He had no authority to move. He ran anyway. He sprinted across the open, exposed flight deck, directly toward the incoming aircraft, and climbed into the rear seat of a parked SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The aircraft Gaido climbed into was loaded. Full fuel tank, bombs still mounted under the wings. If that Japanese plane hit the flight deck, this SBD was going to explode. Gaido knew that. He grabbed the twin .30 caliber machine guns in the rear seat, swiveled them toward the approaching bomber, and opened fire. From the bridge, Admiral William Halsey watched one man stand up in a parked aircraft and pour bullets point blank into a burning plane that was seconds from impact. Witnesses would later call it a personal duel. The Japanese pilot and the American machinist trading fire in the final seconds. Captain George Murray ordered a hard turn to starboard. At the last instant, Gaido's fire poured directly into the cockpit, disrupting the Kai's control. The bomber didn't hit the flight deck square. Its right wing clipped the tail of Gaido's SBD, shearing it clean off, 3 feet from where Gaido was still standing and still firing. The broken Dauntless spun toward the deck edge. The Japanese aircraft's wing separated and skidded into the port catwalk, drenching the ship in fuel. And then, Nakai's plane went over the side and into the sea. Gaido wasn't done. With the plane half hanging off the deck, he grabbed the SBD's fire extinguisher and put out the burning aviation fuel the Japanese bomber had left on the deck. Then, and this is completely on brand for Bruno Gaido, he disappeared. He was convinced he was in trouble. He'd abandoned his battle station. He'd acted without orders. In the pre-war Navy, that got you court-martialed. He hid in the lower decks. Halsey sent a search party. When they finally found him and brought him to the bridge, Gaido stood at attention, waiting to be punished. Instead, Halsey said, "Consider yourself promoted. On the spot. No paperwork. A handshake. 2 full pay grades. Just like that." 4 months later, American codebreakers cracked Japan's next move. A massive assault on Midway Atoll using the same 4 carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Nimitz rushed Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown into position northeast of Midway to set an ambush. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Bruno Gaido climbed into the rear seat of an SBD Dauntless, piloted by Ensign Frank O'Flaherty. Their target? The Japanese carrier Kaga, one of the largest warships on Earth. A Japanese destroyer found them, the Makigumo. Her crew had just watched 3 of their carriers sink. They pulled the 2 Americans aboard and began 11 days of interrogation. The Japanese later claimed Gaido provided useful information. American historians assess that both men likely gave plausible but fabricated answers. No one who knew Bruno Gaido believed he would have broken. This was the man who had run toward a burning aircraft. He wasn't built to break. On June 15th, 1942, 11 days after Midway, Commander Isamu Fujita of the Makigumo received orders to dispose of his prisoners. He asked for volunteers. The crew refused. Even then, even after the humiliation of Midway, the sailors wouldn't raise their hands. They were ordered. In the early hours of the morning, Frank O'Flaherty and Bruno Gaido were bound with ropes, tied to weighted fuel cans, and thrown into the Pacific. They died in the dark, somewhere in the same ocean where they had helped destroy the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. Bruno Gaido was 26 years old. He had served in the United States Navy for 20 months. Bruno Gaido's name is carved into the Courts of the Missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. No ship has ever been named after him. In 1996, he became the first inductee into the Enlisted Combat Air Crew Roll of Honor aboard the USS Yorktown Museum. Dusty Cleiss, the pilot who made his carrier qualification landings with Gaido in the rear seat, lived to 100 years old. Before he died, he wrote a memoir. He dedicated several pages to the machinist who sat in that back seat and said, "You've got wings, haven't you?" Bruno Gaido never made it home. But in one moment, one decision to run the wrong direction when everything in him could have run the other way, he changed the course of a war.